Alright, so here we're looking at converting fractions into percentages. And first we want to know, what is a percent? Okay, we can break down that word percent, that root cent. We know we've heard of the word century, which means 100. So that root cent is going to mean 100. And we're just looking at parts out of 100. Per means kind of like each, so each out of 100. And this is just a little information we want to know. There are three ways to write parts of a whole. If we're talking about parts of 100, that's parts of a whole. Up here in the right-hand corner, this is the percent symbol you want to make sure we're familiar with. I'm sure you've seen it on storefronts with sales and things like that. And I'm using this example of 41 out of 100. Okay, that's the fraction version on the left. This is also 41 hundredths as a decimal. We would read that as 41 hundredths. And both of those are equivalent to 41%. So all of these are equal value, equal parts of a whole. It's basically just three different ways of writing the same thing, and we would use it in different contexts depending on the situation, like fractions, pieces of a pie or something like that. Decimals sometimes more related to money. Percent has many meanings, but one could be also sales and things like that. So there's just three parts of a whole, three ways to write parts of a whole there. And today we're focusing on the percent. And we talked about it in class, but if you weren't there, we had some real life examples of percents. We've already mentioned the shopping bit. We've mentioned sports like football, what a shooting percentage Mohamed Salah might have. I think we saw that he had a 46% shot accuracy. Every time he shoots on goal, it goes on goal 46% of the time. That's almost half the time. Okay. Grades we've talked about in class. Grade is a part of a whole. You get an 86 in science. That 86 is very specific. It's 86 out of 100. It's a part of a whole. It's 86%. So your grades is another real-life example of percents. Okay, so back to our target. We want to convert these fractions to percentages. And I used the wrong word here. Not a multiple, but when the denominator is a factor. Okay, a factor of 100. Okay, this is a trick we could do. Okay, first of all, the first one, 21 out of 100. It's already out of 100. So we don't have to do anything at all except read the numerator as our percent. So 21% if it's out of 100. If it's not out of 100, like this 1/5, we want to make it an equivalent fraction out of 100. Since we're using a multiple, I'm sorry, I said it wrong again, a factor of 100, it can be easily divided into 100 to create the equivalent fraction. So we want to think like we had before. 5 times what number equals 100? Well, 25s make 100. And if we multiply the bottom by 20, we have to multiply the top by 20. 1 times 20 will be 20. Now we have it out of 100. We just read the numerator as our percent. So 1/5. If you have 1/5 of something, you have 20%. Okay, same thing here. 9 over 20. Always set it out of 100 because that's our definition of percent. It's out of 100. You go from 20 to 100. That's 5 times bigger. Therefore, you have to multiply this top 9 by 5. You would get 45 out of 100 and 45%. Okay, 8.4 over 10, same deal. It's just a little trickier maybe with the decimal in the numerator. Now we're going from 10 to 100. That's 10 times bigger. Therefore, we multiply the top by 10. And we talked about this with our last unit. When you're multiplying a decimal by a power of 10, in this case 10 itself with just one zero, the number of zeros is the amount of places you can move the decimal. So 1 0 in 10 means we can move this decimal point one place to the right. It's just basically a little trick to multiplying decimals by powers of 10. So 8.4 becomes 84 because the decimal, it's really kind of just hanging out here, but because there's nothing to the right of it, we don't really need it there. So we have 84 out of 100, and 84% would be the answer for 8.4 out of 10. Okay, but sometimes it's not going to be so convenient where you have the denominator as a factor of 100. Look at 7 over 11. We want to still be able to convert that into a percentage. We have a couple steps here. The first step is simply to divide the numerator by the denominator. So 7 over 11, that's the same thing, we've said this before, as 7 divided by 11. Basically, we're just reading this fraction bar as a division sign. Now, if you put that into your calculators, your iPad calculator or your phone calculator, and I'm letting you do that for this step because this is a step we've learned before. This is a target we've learned before when we're converting fractions into a decimal, is really what we're doing. You would get on your calculator 0.63, and that 63 will repeat for a little while. Okay, if you're not sure how to do 7 divided by 11 manually, like we learned, where we set it up as long division, you can come to tutoring on Tuesdays after school. But for now, we'll just use the calculator for that step because it's an old target, and our focus is mainly going from this step to the percentage. But it's really important to know what we just did was convert the fraction into a decimal. Okay, but now we want to make that decimal into a percentage. And this second step, we move the decimal point 2 places to the right. So here it is here, we go boya, boya, and we have 63.63%. Now I prefer it not to be a decimal within the percent, so I want you to round it to the nearest percentage. Okay, so 63%, 63.63 becomes 64%. Okay, this digit of a 6 to the right of the decimal tells that we round that 3 up to a 4. Okay, we want to be comfortable going the other way too. We just did fractions into a percent. What about percents into fractions? I think this is pretty quick and easy. Let's just do a couple examples here. 20%, remember we said percentages is out of, it's out of 100. So out of 100 literally means that. We go out of 100, 20 out of 100. So that's the fraction. However, you want to simplify the fraction. You want to find a factor that's common to the numerator and denominator. If you find the greatest one, wonderful. That means you'll get the most simplified version. But even if you just have to find a common factor, you'll at least get closer to your answer. Now the greatest common factor here is going to be 20. Divide the top and bottom by 20. 20 divided by 20 is 1. 100 divided by 20 is 1/5. Okay, now say you weren't able to think that 20 was the greatest common factor, but maybe you knew that 10 was. 10 is also a common factor. So let's see what happens if we start to simplify the fraction by 10. 20 divided by 10 is 2. 100 divided by 10 is 10. Now, if you get to a point where there's still a factor of the numerator that is in common with a factor of the denominator, you have to keep dividing. So is there a factor of 2 that is also a factor of 10? And the answer is yes. 2 is the common factor, because 2 times 1 is 2, and 2 times 5 is 10. Now you are at the most simplified form. My main point here is keep simplifying until you're down to a fraction that has no common factors other than 1, and that means you have the fraction reduced to lowest terms, which is another way to say simplified. Here we have 23% is 23 out of 100. 23 is a prime number, okay? So you will not have any common factor of 23 and 100 other than 1. Okay, let's move on to 100%. 100%, well, you could write it as 100 over 100 if you want. If we use that same rule of parts out of 100, any number divided by itself is just one whole thing. If you have 100 out of 100 something, you have one whole thing. So 100% is the whole number 1. Anything less than 100% Now you're dealing with parts of a whole, okay? So it's going to be less than 1, sort of like a decimal is. Okay, now we have 8%. Let's do that one. That's 8 out of 100. Okay, there's a common factor of 4. That might be kind of hard to see, but maybe you know that 2 is a common factor because both those numbers are even, and 2 is a factor of even numbers. You would have 4 over 50. 2 even numbers again means we can divide by 2 again. Okay? You're left with 2 over 25. And if I were to go the other way around, try to convert 2 over 25 into a percent, of course I would get this. They equal each other. Okay, I just want to make sure we're comfortable with this one step of if we have just a decimal, right? So like we had 0.63, if we want to turn that into percent, it's kind of the step of going from fractions to decimals to percent. But what if you're just at decimals? Well, then you just need this one step now that we did earlier of moving the decimal 2 places to the right. So you get 63%. Sometimes you'll see trickier things like 3.5 as a percentage. So if you have a decimal in there, you could still just do that rule of 2 places to the right. And like we've done before, if there's no digit there in the one place that you're moving towards, you have to insert another digit there. So you actually have 350% there. And you will sometimes see percentages bigger than 100. If you have a business that sells more goods the next year than they did the previous, then their percentage increase is going to be more than 100%. Okay, so that's basics on going from fractions to percentages and vice versa.